So our next talk is by Taber MacCallum. Taber MacCallum is the co-founder of Paragon Space Development Corporation, located here in Tucson, Arizona. He's presently involved in the design of life support and thermal control systems for commercial manned spacecraft, suborbital spacecraft, a novel Mars spacesuit portable life support system technology funded by NASA, as well as a hazardous environment life support technology development for the U.S. Navy divers, in which he is the test diver. Mr. MacCallum was a member of the first two-year mission living and working inside Biosphere 2, a 3-acre, materially closed ecological system containing 7 biomes which supported the life of 8 human inhabitants. With that, I'd like to introduce Taber MacCallum.
Thank you. All right. Wow, that's loud. Okay, I want to. This is us making a pizza in Biosphere 2. It took us about 4 months to make a pizza in Biosphere 2. We first had to grow the wheat, we had to get the goats pregnant, we had to then have them kid, and then we had to milk them and turn them into cheese. It's a long process. It's only a lot easier now just to order from a pizza shop, but that gives, that was the life. I mean, this was figuring out meal planning 4 to 6 months in advance in Biosphere 2 was one of the main things that we found ourselves doing. This is Buckminster Fuller, who double dog dared us to build Biosphere 2 in 1984 at the conference where we left that conference saying, okay, now let's go find funding for Biosphere 2. So the question then, the biggest question we had after he double dog dared us to build a biosphere, we didn't actually call it Biosphere 2 then, he said build a biosphere, was what's a biosphere? The sort of the funny thing about the word biosphere now is that it was not in the lexicon until the early 90s. I was spelling that word down the phone through about 91, 92. So the big question was, what's a biosphere? So a biosphere is, as we know now, it's a materially closed system, a planet. It's energetically open, so light comes in. It's informationally open, information goes in and out. And so we were going to build one, so we said, okay, well, we can't gravitationally close it, so we'll build a structure over it, and it will be a living system in a sealed environment. And our big question was, can you build a biosphere? Can you take these ecosystems that developed on a planetary scale and reduce them down and bottle them up into a small structure, and will they work? Can you take a rainforest and bottle it up and still have it be something that looks like a rainforest, or will it just turn into green slime? And if you do, then what do you have? Well, you sort of have another biosphere to compare with. And the difference between a biosphere and an ecosystem, in our mind then anyway, was a biosphere had several of these ecosystems, a rainforest, a savanna, an agriculture, all in one system versus an ecosystem. This, when Bucky dared us to do it, was the state-of-the-art enclosed system ecology. And then Claire Folsom had been bottling up ocean slime and algae, and under NASA grants studying very carefully exactly how all the microbes in this little 5-liter ecosystem worked. So we were going to go off and try to build the biosphere. See if we can get a pointer here. This is a rainforest. We decided we were going to have all the major tropical biomes. There's a savanna down, see if this pointer is working there, yep. A savanna in this area here, an ocean, a marsh, a desert, and then of course we needed an agriculture because we wanted people to live in our biosphere, and a habitat, which is where we had the kitchen and medical facilities and the like, and then this dome on the edge here is the variable volume chamber that allows the air trapped in this rigid container to expand and contract. So the first thing we did was try to build a small thing that would replicate the big thing and see if we could make it airtight, and I begin to understand how these ecosystems might function. When we put a person inside for the first time, we could not get a single doctor to take responsibility for being the chief physician for the duration, because they were sure that the gas buildup inside and fungal buildup inside and things like that would in the course of 24 hours render the person dead. The person survived, and we had actually up to 30-day stints in this test module, about 1/400th the size of Biosphere 2, but it allowed us to test a lot of the waste recycling systems and air handling systems and things like that. At the same time, we were building Biosphere 2 on a fast-track What fast track means is that you've designed the foundation. In this case, we had a stainless steel line. So Biosphere 2 sits in a pan of 3 acres of stainless steel. But you haven't really designed anything on top. And there was literally people whose job it was to run from the design studio to the site with the drawings and beat the cement truck. We were getting these incredible situations where the people in building were literally getting ahead of the design and just sort of designing it themselves on the fly. It got really crazy there for a while. At the same time, I'm sort of giving you the breadth of how the project felt while we were in the middle of it. We had to train a crew. One of the ways we decided we were going to train this crew that would be isolated and confined in Biosphere 2 was to say you had to spend at least 3 or 4 months on a ship out at sea, and this was the ship that we used for Biosphere in training. And press began. We had this test module that you see pictured here in the Life magazine, and the other pictures are of models. And there was something so compelling about this idea. We were getting letters, people congratulating us for having built Biosphere 2, and other people who said they were now in jail but would love to be a crew member and they knew all about isolation. This is, in the center is, in the hat, the red scarf is Ed Bass, who ultimately funded Biosphere 2. And this is the other crew training out in the outback of Australia, about a 5-hour dirt road drive from the nearest bar and about 10 hours from the nearest clinic. And these Aboriginals on each side are two of the smartest and most amazing people you'll ever spend several months with. I was lost out in the outback of Australia, and they seemed to know exactly where they were. Amazing marksmen. So we had to design, how do you create something like a rainforest? So we had lots of experts from botanical gardens saying, well, this is what a rainforest is, and we did collecting expeditions at the top here with the helicopters in Venezuela, in Mexico, and we collected plants and we grew them up in greenhouses and then craned them into the biosphere and began literally assembling the terrestrial biomes. But we didn't understand the aquatic biomes well enough to do that, and I'll get into that in just a sec. This is Biosphere 2 now, sort of is growing. These large tanks here are the variable volume chambers, so they're connected by a tunnel underground, and a big membrane goes across this tank to a pan in the middle, and this pan goes up and down, allowing the air to expand and contract, and you can actually see this if you go out there. These other buildings are the energy center. We had to extract heat from the biosphere, because as you can imagine, it's the biggest solar oven ever made. We once turned off the cooling, sort of accidentally. And in a course of about 15 minutes, we went from 70 degrees to 120 degrees inside in the course of a hot summer day. So getting all that heat out of Biosphere 2 was essentially the main job of this energy center. The marine biomes, we had to literally move in blocks of animals and plants because the marine biomes are so complex in the complements of species inside that you have to move them in literally meter cube blocks of marsh were transferred from Florida. At the time, it was illegal to bring mangoes into Arizona because they had some disease. And the thick Georgia truck driver gets to the border of Arizona, and they say, "What do you have, sir?" He says, "Well, I got mangroves." He said, "You have mangoes in that truck?" "I certainly do have mangroves in my truck." It took us 3 weeks to convince them that they weren't actually mangoes because nobody on the border had actually ever seen a mango tree before. Then they discovered fire ants, and then it was a huge number. But anyway, we finally got all these blocks of marsh and ocean into Biosphere 2 and sealed it up. There is about 65 miles of glass edge seam in Biosphere 2 that's hand shot and vacuum tested, and so we'd have crews of mountain climbers up on ropes, literally doing all the sealing. You can't really see my finger. Doing the sealing, these lawn seams here. And so then we had Biosphere 2, finally all put together and seeming to work. So now we are having an ability to compare biospheres, to have an objective comparison, which is great for science, because now I can at least tell the difference between two examples of something that we're calling a biosphere. As ridiculous as this comparison may be, it is yet still a comparison. One is an oracle, one's in our solar system, one's 3 acres, one's billions of acres, 13 versus 5 biomes. We managed to get 3,800 species in there, which is actually very packed, more species per unit area than you would normally see. We were thinking that would sort of naturally devolve into something a bit simpler than the unit area would have. And later, a science article came out saying Biosphere 2 failed because they lost 30% of their species, and we were ecstatic. But a lot of interesting communication problems with how you make a scientific experiment available and understandable to the press and to inquiring people. Only 8 humans. The energy sources were pretty much the same, and only 18 years old.
List tonight from the home office in Lebanon, top 10 features of Biosphere 2. You know about this, Paul?
I've read on
The environmental experiment taking place in Arizona.
Some people are going into
8
a big
people locked into a biosphere. The
Staying there for 2 years.
environment of the Earth, they're going to stay there for 2 years.
And it reproduces all the different environments.
Exactly, Paul. Nice going. Thank you very much for the enhancement. Yes, here now, top 10 features of that biosphere. Are you ready? Number 10, they have themselves a gap. Number 9, all-you-can-eat food pellet Tuesdays. Number 8, a surprising number of handguns. Number 7, Fluffy the Bio-Poodle. Number 6, boxes and boxes of biodegradable condoms. Number 5, 8 barbers, no waiting. Number 4, a really big Garfield suction cup doll. Number 3, more special effects, more steamy love scenes, and more high-speed car chases than in Biosphere 1. Number 2, overpowering smell of Windex, and the number 1 feature of the Biosphere 2, the clapper. There you go.
So obviously everyone loved to compare these biospheres to one another. The media loved to use Biosphere 2 as this sort of emblematic place where people would be running away for sanctuary. So the last of these species to be put in were the 8 of us. Little did we know, it was actually the first time we'd ever been inside Biosphere 2 alone. And it felt very strange to be just the 8 of us, because we'd been building and fixing and preparing this thing all up until like late the night before. And so now we have these 2 biospheres, as I said, to compare. There was a lot of different reasons that people had for building Biosphere 2, which was a strength and also a weakness in its execution. I was interested in the space applications of this is a unit, a fundamental unit of life. All life that we know exists in the context of a biosphere. So if we really are going to settle the solar system or things like that, we're going to go in one way or another in the form of biospheres. But it was also the first time we could ever study an ecosystem of some complexity in a completely airtight environment, so you could track the carbon atoms around inside the biosphere and study how ecosystems worked and responded to the environment. One of the interesting things we saw, because we had a high CO2, was the first instance of coral bleaching ever recorded on the planet. It was actually in Biosphere 2, and then recognized about 5 years later in the Caribbean as being the same thing. This is a very early shot of the rainforest. These trees and plants now all reach the ceiling of the biosphere, but so it gives you an idea of what the structure and life inside look like. And this is its chief inhabitant, a galago, who ate the bananas and other fruit that lived in the biosphere and would compete with us for the bananas. This is the technosphere, we called it. This is essentially underneath all of the biosphere is the machines that keep the environment the right temperature, filter the air, cool the air, heat the air, treat the water. It's all of those mechanical systems that make it possible for the life on top to work. One of the sort of emblematic things that Biosphere 2 did was, at the time, technology was thought of as bad. People were saying, well, technology is destroying the planet. And so we said, well, let's just envelop life in technology and see if that's really true. A lot of people came away from the biosphere saying, well, it's really how you use technology. That was the ocean. This is the desert. And there was a really interesting interaction that began to happen with the people because we really depended on the plants, obviously, for our oxygen, and they depended on us for their CO2. And this is the habitat of the biosphere, our mini city. The habitat had obviously a kitchen. We took it in turns to cook. Every 8 days, one of us would cook breakfast and then the following lunch and dinner, or a day's worth of food. We had our apartments. Each of us had an individual sort of loft and apartment, analytical laboratories, workshop, animal bay. We had goats and pigs and chickens. Command room, where we would communicate with the outside. A medical facility, some machine shops and the like, crew quarters. So this is where we spent a lot of our time working in here. This is touring of that habitat. This is the kitchen and a dining room. And going along up to the medical facility was on this floor, the analytical lab that we'll see in a minute, and coming up here into the command room where we would have video conferences with the outside. And this is in the analytical laboratory. We did all of our gas analysis and air and water analysis inside the biosphere using actually the first computer-controlled analytical instrumentation. This is the agriculture. On the right up here, the bananas. This was the banana storage room and ripening room. This was the only room in the biosphere that was actually locked to keep midnight hungers from having us go steal down bananas. And this is enough area properly lit to feed 10 people. The major problem we had in food production, and food production was a problem, was all of this structure over the top of the biosphere reduced the incident light more than we'd originally calculated. And it's one of the lessons learned about Biosphere 2 was that in our rush to build it, there was a lot of, well, we don't need to model that. And computer modeling, while in an early stage, this was the late 80s, and this amazingly fast thing called the 286 has come out recently. We weren't properly calculating, and this is it's an interesting play that goes in back and forth in management. I'll get a bit more into management, but there's sort of a hubris began to develop in the design of the biosphere, the management team, that if we build it, it will work. We were further restricted in our caloric intake because we had the worst sunlight year in recorded history in Arizona. It was the lowest light was our first year. A bunch of Goddard scientists came out and said, don't worry, don't worry. There's never 2 El Niños in a row. This El Niño year will go away, and next year will be a very high light year. You'll get lots of food, you'll be very happy. The first 2 back-to-back El Niños ever recorded were the first 2 years that we were in Biosphere 2, and the second year had less light than the first. So we got very hungry. But still, nonetheless, we had this sort of very interesting relationship with the environment that is something you really don't get in the world we're in today. This, these sweet potatoes were grown using our carbon dioxide. So the sweet potatoes were sort of in a way part human. And in eating the sweet potatoes, we were very much part sweet potato. In fact, we turned orange. Our calluses turned orange, and our complexion was orange because of the sweet potatoes. Due to the low light, they were one of the only tubers that would grow. So we had lots and lots of sweet potatoes. This is sort of a typical lunch. We'd have a patty of sort of a grain sweet potato patty and a lot of beet greens and a very watery soup and a bit of salad. And as you can see, this is the doctor. He's not entirely thrilled with his lunch. Another problem that began to happen was that we were low on oxygen. We were losing oxygen in a way that we really didn't understand. We had thought, and as you might think, if oxygen goes down, carbon dioxide is going to go up in about a 1-to-1 ratio. And we were seeing a precipitous fall in carbon dioxide, in oxygen, but not really seeing any appreciable climb in oxygen, in CO2. Oh, I'm getting this backwards. There was a point where I was looking for about 10 tons of oxygen, and the oxygen was my job, so sort of embarrassing. This is about enough oxygen to fill up half this room. It's a sizable mass of oxygen in liquid form. so now we've got sort of two issues. We're losing oxygen in a way we don't understand, and we're on this very low-calorie diet. And some interesting things began to happen. We were at the equivalent of 16,000 feet of elevation in oxygen partial pressure, but we hadn't adapted to that lowered oxygen. It took us about 18 months to get there, but our hemoglobin had not increased at all. We had a compound called 2,3-DPG, which changes how hard the hemoglobin holds on to oxygen, and it had adjusted just like we had been our first day off the plane in Lhasa. So we were forever chronically in altitude sickness. And so we were suffocating and we were starving and the psychological problems were beginning. And we sort of didn't know what to do because none of this was in our mission rules. We had sort of a nascent mission rule set. Well, we thought CO2 would be a problem long before oxygen, so we never bothered to think about oxygen level mission rules. And every day sort of felt like the other day, the day before, and we were a little bit like, the frogs in increasingly warming water. We really didn't feel like there was an issue that we had to deal with at the time. We were doing a lot of blood chemistry work. We had a pretty good clinic inside. And we would do lots of workups. This is us probably at about a year, 18 months. Well, this would be 92. So yeah, we were about a year into it. In this stage, and a big question began to happen: how do we know it's safe? We had a very interesting cocktail of gases that had built up by now. I was spending a lot of my time. This is me in the biosphere trying to figure out, well, what does this cocktail of gases in our atmosphere mean? What is the reflection of that was in our water and obviously in our food? We figured we were going to get some sort of sick building syndrome buildups, and a lot of that would be cleaned up by the plants and some scrubbing systems we had. But we never thought we'd have these strange medical issues on top of it. Our blood workup made us look like a hibernating bear. And so it became very interesting. Doctors were publishing in the proceedings of the national academies about the medical condition of the biospherians. And so we thought, well, if we bring in food or we bring in oxygen, we're going to mask whatever is making the oxygen go away in this very bizarre medical condition that we're seeing that everyone seems to be very interested in. All right, I can tough it out another day. On top of that, we had this, as I said, sort of this really interesting psychological situation. We thought that given it's 3 acres and we have a rainforest and a savanna and an ocean and all these things to do, and all this work to do in this incredible project, but just the necessity of the project would keep sort of the psychological issues at bay. And we're all very type A people. I mean, we all went into this, we'd known each other for like 6 or 8 years before going in, so we weren't just like a new team, but if there's anything goes wrong, we were sure that we could handle it. And it's amazing how hard it is to handle the isolation and confinement. It was sort of like being in a monastery when you really didn't want to be in a monastery. It's a very psychologically intense experience, the monastic experience, I've come to find out. Essentially what happens is after about 6 months, a lot of the issues that you sort of been able to put up with, the baggage that you were carrying, begins to get to you. And you have, classically, you hear flashbacks. A lot of sort of obsessive compulsive thinking goes on. I had this incredible desire to talk with this girl I fell out with in my sophomore year in high school, and I hadn't spoken with her since. But we sort of broke up in a way that, well, high school students break up. And I just had to call it, and I couldn't not call it. So I mean, this poor lady in Kansas says, "Hi, it's me. Remember me from last?" And that made it go away. But it was a piece of baggage I sort of just had to get rid of. And a lot of us were dealing with this. And so you've got hungry, oxygen-deprived, psychologically nuts people running around running the biosphere, and a lot of big scientific problems to try to figure out. We had a classic crew split, 4-4, management versus science, in essence, about how we should operate this biosphere and learn from it. And then, that doesn't even begin to say what it was like to re-enter afterwards. And I'll sort of touch on that now. You realize how much you're dependent on your habits. My habits were, my pruning shears and my radio, and that was it. Car keys, bags, books, wallets, all this. None of those habits existed after 2 years. So I was pretty hopeless for a while until I kind of got all those habits back. And Bob Bridges was there to see me come out, and as was Ken. So a few other people have sort of known me from this crazy time. Feasts were something that were very important for us as a psychological, to sort of break the hunger. It turns out about every month, we really wanted to just have so much food out there you could not eat it all. And so we'd save a little bit of food every day. We'd save a bit of food, put it aside, and then that month we'd make up a birthday or something, and we'd have, and that was about the only time you could really bring everybody together and just sort of put everything aside and fill our bellies. So the question then is sort of what came of Biosphere 2? This question, can you build a biosphere? We've got all these problems that I told you about. It turned out that the oxygen issue was that too much organic carbon was put into the soil. So oxygen goes into the soil, microbes munch on the organic carbon, the compost producing carbon dioxide, eating up the oxygen. Well, that would be understandable, and we measured the amount of CO2 coming off the soil, and that seemed to all make sense. But where's that CO2 going? Well, that was being absorbed into the concrete structure, internal concrete structure of the biosphere. We sort of had a built-in CO2 scrubber. So with that CO2 now in the concrete, the plants could never get at it to make oxygen again. So that was really a design problem. Clearly we could get more light into the biosphere. We brought in a bunch of electric lights later and grew all the food that the next crew after us needed. Psychological issues, I think, and I can talk a bit during sort of Q&A about that, were largely a training issue and selection issue. So the question we had was, do we understand enough about Biosphere 2 in its behavior to answer the question, can you build a biosphere? The problem with that statement as a hypothesis, as you can imagine, is there's no negative test. There's no way to disprove, to prove that you cannot build a biosphere. So if the biosphere you built doesn't work, the question remains, well, did you just not build it properly? And it looks like, from Biosphere 2, from the data, that all of the issues we had in Biosphere 2 were related to the design of that biosphere, not inherent in the act of enclosing an ecosystem in glass and steel and sealing it up. So it does look like we have inherited ecosystems on this planet that can be bottled up, transported, and recreated somewhere else. I mean, this is, for me, I thought a fantastic result to have such a pliable system of life that we're on, that we can bottle it up, reconfigure it, and move it and take it somewhere. I think that's personally a fabulous result. So we could build biospheres on other planets in a variety of configurations, and as an object of study to understand how biospheres work. So 2 years and 20 minutes later, we came out of the biosphere. The 20 minutes was due to Jane Goodall speaking too long. So we then looked at, well, what was the issue with some of the issues with how Biosphere 2 was balanced, and came up with a patent that essentially said that ecosystems use carbon like currency is to an economy. And if you have too much currency in the economy, you'll get into a boom and bust cycle. You get a whole bunch of photosynthesis, all the carbon will be in the plants, and then there won't be enough carbon, and the plants will start to crash, and the animals will eat the plants, and then you get this bust and then a boom. But if you restrict the carbon, you sort of like pretend the carbon's like the central bank, and you just squeeze a little bit in every now and then when it's needed, the system stabilizes out quite nicely. And so we tested this in small systems, and this is an ecosystem that we flew. This was on the International Space Station. We also flew them on Mir. and bred in those the first animals to go through a complete life cycle in space. These are small aquatic animals, and they had lots of interesting behavior issues and morphology issues, but successfully went through 5 or 6 consecutive generations in these little ecosystems. This is now post-biosphere Paragon, the company that myself and a bunch of other people started out of ISU. From ISU Net was really was one of the first, if not the first, company started over the internet by people who'd never actually shaken their hand, all being ISU grads. This is, and the previous slide was how do you grow plants in sealed containers. This is a payload we're working with Bob and Odyssey Moon on. We will talk next to grow the first plant on the moon or on another planet. And this is a sort of a demonstration that we worked with Odyssey Moon on of that. Paragon is also working on the Orion vehicle, doing some of the thermal control systems for that. We have a test chamber here in Tucson that sets up essentially all the interfaces for a life support system for a commercial spacecraft. And we are beginning to use that to test life support system components and subsystems, either for suborbital or orbital spacecraft. Machine bay, machine shop, and the like laboratories to support that activity. We're working on the next generation spacesuit for Orion and other expeditions, and also the contraption on the side there is some advanced life support technology really keyed into using Mars resources for a portable life support system. This is a dive system that we looked at a lot of how spacesuits work, and the Navy said, we're trying to find a way to dive in very hazardous environments like jet fuels and chemical warfare agents. It was an invention of the year. We're still working with the Navy on it. We should be in full-up deployment of a system early next year. This is a radiator that's meant to be also part of the structure. This is a way of rejecting heat from spacecraft. You essentially cool a fluid, having the radiator reject heat radiatively from a spacecraft. Looking at some oxygen production systems, direct electrolysis of CO2 is the kind of stuff we're doing now. And we're supporting a lot of the commercial ventures. So I thought I'd get into a little bit of what in all of these sort of crazy projects that we work on and work with different people on seems to make the successful ones versus the not successful ones. So I thought I'd go in. This is a little bit text heavy, but I think it's sort of an interesting run at what are the Achilles heels of these projects. As we see so many of them seem to get, like everything is there. And you say they're doing this project at the right time in history, they've got the right place, the people are all put together, they've got a technology solution that seems to work, the resources are coming, their business plan looks solid, their ideas and their vision for the company are compelling, and they've got leadership. There are so many of these kinds of things that have then just crashed and burned. And I kept trying to think, well, why is that? Well, most of them were at the implementation stage when that happened. It seemed to me that I'd see them get that far. They were bending metal, or very close to bending metal. And this is where it would go. So they've got everything lined up now, and it's not working. So I thought, well, this is one of the basics. Do you have the best people in the right seats, a good handle on resources? Did the leadership have a good grounding in the science involved, in the physics, the biology? Did they really know what the project was about? Did they make and document their decisions so they knew what was going on to keep them from going in circles? Were they goal-oriented? Systems engineering-wise, did they have a good process in place? So they got their requirements down, they're working. All these things seem to be generally, to varying degrees, in place. Did they spend too much time looking for the killer innovation? They would, I've seen some areas where people would sort of say, this is what we're going to do, this is so cool, and then, oh wait, look at that over there, and then run over and work on that. But so But all these things didn't seem to yet really be at the core of this. Did they have people that were a good judge of people and talent? Were they developing a self-sustaining organization? Seemed to be an issue that I've seen. Is there a dependency on a central command? A lot of organizations become very, very dependent on a very centralized command and can't grow. Did they stick to their business plan? Were they learning and adapting? I mean, these were all sort of basic things that you question, and different organizations do to varying degrees. Was there communication? This is my favorite saying, by the way. The problem with communication is the illusion that you have actually communicated. Everybody's laboring under this illusion that a communication occurred, and then you only find out later it didn't happen. And certainly that gets more and more difficult as the complexity of the organization grows. These space endeavors can get amazingly complex. You have your engineering department, your quality department, your finance department, your manufacturing department, health and human safety, human resources, it goes on. And so you get this amazingly complex organization even with 50 people. And so communication becomes harder and harder. Is there assured access to validated information? This actually becomes one of the very difficult issues. I always thought it'd be good to quote Jesus in an aerospace engineering talk. But the truth, I say the data will set you free, really looking at, how do I know this data is true? And of course one has to quote Huxley, in the deepest sin against the human mind is to believe things without evidence. Again, making sure the data that is being used to operate the organization is valid. None of this is surprising, but in leadership, clearly, you're sort of focusing down on leadership and this train of thought. And seeing the reality of the situation is actually a very key part of that leadership equation of what a leader, I think, should do. So it's always fun to have Kerouac and Burroughs and Ginsberg sort of in a talk like this, because they were seeing the reality of America's cultural situation and portraying it in a very clear way for the first time. The Beats were really opening a lot of people's eyes to the reality, and that's what a good leader does. Somebody with a vision for a business future is opening a new window to the reality of a future situation or an extant situation. And they gave us a very unvarnished view of what America was at that time. This is Neil Cassidy and Jack Kerouac there in the picture. Obviously, ego is an issue. So I kept sort of circling around the leadership issue. Being identified with the project. A lot of people's self-worth seems to be tied into the success of that project, which makes them make risk decisions inappropriately. As Colin Powell said, never let your ego get so close to your position that when the position goes, your ego goes with it, because it's very hard to make an objective business decision when your ego is part of the price you pay for the risk you're going to take. Space is obviously very not forgiving, a very humble endeavor, and I think the humility required to really honestly put together an engineering program is almost at odds with the ego and the audacity required to go ahead and try to do it. These, you really get into some conflicts that I think in the hubris required to go do it or have the team that could do it. So I found anyway, and I think it's something worth in your own life considering, that the Achilles heel of leadership is emotional intelligence. That being the ability to perceive or manage, express, utilize emotions, and not have them really get the best of you, to feel, to communicate. I mean, these are all, an emotionally intelligent person has these tools at their disposition as part of their leadership. It's a requirement for leadership, in my estimation anyway. The ability to monitor one's own, to be a good observer of your own emotions and others. And especially it helps the organization get through milestone failures. The way the leadership can emotionally handle that event and not sort of go crazy, go jump off the cliff, take the rest of the organization with them, you know, go drive the board insane. You know, lots of these kinds of things happen when a milestone, a very hard, when the program hits the rocks, and it will, is when you really need this sort of mature leadership, in my mind. Now, this is not some new idea. There's a 2004 Army Research Institute requested a proposal for validated measures to assess emotional intelligence. Because clearly you get people under a lot of stress in a military situation. They especially liked the end of this RFP. The ability to perceive and manage and express and utilize emotions has profound ramifications for understanding and supporting human cognition and performance. So we really find that you can be as smart as the dickens, but if you haven't got an emotional maturity coupled with that, you know, you've really got your Achilles heel's been sliced. So it's not really a new field. It's an up-and-coming field, but I think you don't hear a whole lot about it on this continent because, well, we really don't get much emotional education in this country, which is why Americans are typically such bad negotiators. Other cultures do a better job in that part of education, so Americans tend to fall flat on their face when trying to negotiate with Russians or Japanese, largely because they're in far more control of their emotional situation and the emotions of their negotiating opponent than the American is. So, and even Darwin noted the importance of emotional expression for survival. So, about this point, people say, but you know, honestly, this is a technical field. You know, we can just analyze our way out of any problem. Don't, you know, how can emotions be such a big component? And you know, you sort of have to agree. So if I make this thing work, this is. Darn. Well, this was the knack part of, anyway. The issue is, well, we all know, especially those of us who are engineers, that we're geeks, and the synonym for geek in MS Word is, you know, drip or bore or nerd, you know, the classic socially inept engineer. So isn't it sort of a shame that, you know, we are already stereotyped as being socially inept and emotionally immature because we love technology. So it almost creates this dichotomy from the very beginning. So the question then is, how does one develop emotional intelligence? And how do you find it in others? How do you get to where this is something that you're also trying to develop along with calculus? It really is a training thing. Settings that allow self-observation, and then doing honest self-observation, leadership training in intense situations. I think the ISU summer session is one of the best emotional intelligence developer organizations or programs on the planet. Just to see the beginning and end of people who've been through the ISU SSP is it's a pretty amazing difference a lot of people go through. Sports obviously does that. The ability to observe survival reactions. I race motorcycles. This is how I get there, and each people do it differently. We put prospective employees in emotionally difficult situations in high-pressure social settings. We will generally, at 4:30 in our organization, we shut down. We have what we call beer o'clock, and new prospective hires come to beer o'clock, and they get surrounded by 20 other people who shoot questions at them, and we see how they do. And this is a very effective selecting tool we have found to determine their attitude. How self-aware are they? And these kinds of valid observations made in high-stress situations, I think, are the surest route to knowing yourself. Because if you're not in a high-stress situation, you really don't know sort of what you're made of. your personality, your persona is able to sort of take over and project another, who you think you might be. So what does this have to do maybe with education and being a student? I've said this to a lot of students. When we look at a resume from somebody graduating, if that student or that recent graduate has a lot of project experience, meaning they've addressed open-ended questions, they put themselves in a position of having to go and accomplish something, and all the stressors of that, we find that that is the best indicator of a successful prospect. We don't need people who know how to take tests. We don't need people that can operate with the book closed. That skill is of no use to us. And so what we're finding is that people who either do projects, motorheads are great, people who love to take apart their cars, people who have selected and done projects through their university career tend to do a lot better because you put yourself in a situation of a stress outcome result that I think you learn more from than most classrooms. So as an employer, I would recommend to all of you to find ways to get project experience on your resume, especially team project experience on your resume where you've put together a team. And there's lots of, AIAA does a lot of programs, there's a lot of great programs out there. I think it's the central failing of most engineering education. I was interested, I talked to the Dean of Engineering here at the University of Arizona, and he told me that the entering class in engineering has the highest SAT scores of any entering college department at the University of Arizona. The exiting class has the lowest SAT scores of any exiting class. And that's simply because the smart people drop out because they got bored and went and did something else. So there's, I think, an issue in education. I won't go much beyond that except to say, commend you to think about this in your life. One of my other favorite sayings is that the unexamined life is not worth living. So I think we're at a bit of time. Any questions?
So what would you say is the biggest lesson learned from Biosphere 2 as far as trying to make a closed-loop life support system for particular spacecraft applications, just in general?
Two things. In terms of technical lessons, you saw that test module that was 1/300th the size. One thing we didn't do with that test module is put all the same materials in their relative percentages in mass and surface area. We would have caught the oxygen problem in that test module had we done that. We didn't really have much of any concrete inside, so that absorption we never picked up. There was very early on a modeling effort began where we were going to model carbon dioxide and how that might behave in Biosphere 2. And the person doing that work showed his model, and he was showing sort of the status of his modeling effort, and he showed how his model showed carbon dioxide going negative. The management said, anybody who's going to show me a graph of negative carbon dioxide in an ecosystem really doesn't know what he's doing. In fact, this modeling thing just seems stupid. No more money for modeling. And again, I think a lot of the issues we've had would have been caught had there been more analysis done. Now, we're in a place now where we can get paralyzed by modeling. We can do so much modeling now that there's got to be a balance. But in that case, not enough was done. And so I think it's very important to figure out where analysis should end and where testing should begin, and really work that out associated with the project goals and the funding and how much risk you're willing to take. In management, a lot of the management issues I talked about were really based around the Biosphere 2 experience, as well as others, in terms of the ability of the management. One of them was management who understood operations or was willing to hand over to an operations-based management versus a build management. It's one thing to start the company. It's one thing to start the project, get it built up. But operations is a really different mindset. And there wasn't a good transition to that. And I guess one last interesting sort of piece of history was, of course, we were over budget, we were late, so Ed said, look, you know, you're getting $150 million to the day you close the door. And if you can't close the door with $150 million, we're just all going to go home. But if you close the door and you get this thing built, now I'm going to give you operating money. Seems like a good idea. Motivates them to get it closed, motivates operation. So what the management essentially had to do was cut back on the testing regime and a lot of the modeling and get right into what was defined as the 2-year mission was beginning of operations. And so all of the testing, we had months of testing planned before getting into that 2-year mission, went out the door. So we get into the 2-year mission, and even that you could say is okay, but now management's in a quandary because they said, we're ready for the 2-year mission. Everything's checked out. We're not going to have any problems. Now we can operate Biosphere 2 and mine the data, but we weren't really. So when we began to have problems in 6 months, management was very reluctant to go tell anybody that there was a problem because they had to tell Ed, we're ready. And so the unintended consequence of that financial structure led to a lot of the immediate issues that Biosphere 2 had because the management was trying to keep the problems under wraps because they were going to get in trouble with their funders if it came out that they really weren't ready for the 2 years. So watching how funding is used to motivate the management team to a particular course of action might unintentionally affect the later product is I think one of the lessons we have.
Well, you in the later part of your lecture talked about how emotional intelligence comes from high stress situations. So while you were in the biosphere, and I'd say that's a pretty high stress situation, what did you really learn about yourself from this whole experience that isn't really related to the whole goals of the project?
Well, I think I learned a lot of humility. You know, I was like, there's a problem, I can fix it. There was a lot of problems I couldn't fix. And I think I understood a lot more about how important the interpersonal relations are, not only among the team inside, but through the whole project. We had a real, not only a conflict between crew members inside, but also with the mission control. And so communication was really breaking down. And it was, I think the interesting part for me was that at the root of a lot of these inability to get along and communicate were things that really had nothing to do with the situation we were in. You know, one classic is that one person only later realized that behaviors of another crew member were reminding her of her brother, and that was driving her crazy. And so it's really important, I find, to try to figure out why am I having this emotional reaction to this situation? You know, what is that red flag that just went off in my head? And so I think I learned a lot more about sort of stepping back and saying, you know, why am I so angry about what's going on? And, you know, is that anger really associated with the current situation and that other person's behavior, or is it triggering something else in my history that is making me angry? So I think it was one of the first times I sort of had the opportunity to make that observation that my emotional response to a given set of circumstances was inappropriate to the circumstances is really based on my personal history.
As you mentioned in the slide before, like there were problems with depression issues, and so was there any psychiatrist available in Biosphere that was ready to treat the patient or something like that?
That was one of the areas that we thought that sort of the training we had was really going to make, you know, and the environment we created, but there wasn't going to be much in the way of psychological problems because we were pretty ignorant about the whole topic, quite frankly. So going in, we didn't have anybody with a psychological background, nor had we even set up for crew members to have access to professionals outside by phone or video phone. So, you know, about 6 months into this, it's pretty clear that I and others have clinical depression to varying degrees. We don't know if that's because of the oxygen or the food or the situation or whatever, but, you know, there you are. And so I found myself interviewing psychiatrists on the outside over the phone. And it's sort of funny, you call up and say, hi, I'm in that biosphere 2 thing, and I think I'm going crazy, but I'm not sure. To help. The first 2 I didn't like, the third I liked. And, you know, you're having flashbacks, you're obsessing over this high school sweetheart. You know, flashback, very vivid flashbacks, and you see this in Antarctic stations too. It's very common. You'll be there like in the sweet potato patch, and suddenly you're 6, and I mean, you sort of know you're still in the sweet potato patch, but it's like you're suddenly dreaming. I mean, it's very vivid, and it's some emotional issue that your mind has decided you're going to deal with right here and now, and so you really think you're sort of going nuts because you don't have all these great distractions. I can't go to the movies, get drunk, you know, run off to, you know, so you're really sort of stuck with yourself. And I found just talking to somebody about what I was experiencing and have them explain to me what was going on actually really cured the clinical depression, because it was sort of the fear of, you know, what is going on that was at the heart of a lot of those issues. And I tried to tell the next crew, you know, you're going to split into separate groups. You should really get to know a shrink on the outside because you're probably going to want to call. They were just like me going, if there's a problem, I'll fix it. I know all the crew for years. You know, I can't imagine that you guys were just crazy. And, you know, 3 months later, who was that person that you used? You know, it's very hard to tell somebody who is that type A that there's going to be an issue. And so I think in terms of training, we didn't have durations or intensity that was long enough to get to where we experienced real isolation in the training. And so I'd say anybody who's going to go to Mars, going to be in a long-term space mission, you got to spend a lot of time in isolation because we didn't have issues at all for 6 months. And you know, they really didn't get intense for a year. So it takes a while for this stuff to really build up.
Imagine if you're going to do it again. Listening to your presentation, I found fascinating that there's, you know, it seems like pieces of it, you know, are process control issues, you know, for want of a state model of what was really going on in the systems, you know, ended up with a lot of frustration and unresolved deals. Given if you were to do it again and you had the advantages that you could have that could be brought to the table now, what else would have to be different in your mind to better ensure the opportunities for success?
Well, you know, there's a ream of design issues that clearly you would go in and fix. I mean, you sort of want to fix obviously all the problems that we saw here, and the goal of doing it again would be to sort of get to the next layer of problems. You know, what are the issues that were masked by the issues we had? And I think that really boils down to leadership. That's properly balancing analysis and design and testing. That's fundamentally really a leadership program where there's very clear understanding of the goals. Why am I building this biosphere? We had very diversified goals, and there was environmentalists who wanted to understand how deserts work. There were space geeks like me that wanted to go to Mars. There were all of these different. Biosphere 2 was like an ink blot test. You know, everybody could see what they most desired in it. You know, of course, the press was like 4 men, 4 weeks, 2 years. What's going to happen? So the very, very clear goal setting, I think, would have helped align the various aspects of the project to get a clearer answer. So a very well articulated goal, and then leadership that would stick to that goal is probably the single thing that I think would be the next thing to do. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure if I...
In part, it crosses in this notion that there's a technical piece of it which could certainly be done at a level which would eliminate a lot of the ambiguity. But there's this piece of your element of what's peeling back the next layer. Okay, that's involved there that I think is the sort of the discussion that it would lead to something, the next level of work actually being done. But I find myself with more questions, than coming into it.
Yeah, well, good science does that. If you haven't got 2 questions for every answer, you're not doing your job.
We have time for maybe one more question.
So after you realized that something was going on emotionally and you started seeking help, did it get better, and did your crewmates seek help also, or did it just get worse until you guys got out of there?
As far as I know, there was the split that I talked about. There was 2 men and 2 women in each split. Interestingly, 1 couple in each of the splits. We sort of thought everybody would look tasty after a year or 2, and everybody was paired up, but that actually never happened. So we had this interesting split of 2 men and 2 women in each group, and 1 couple. I was in one of those couples. And the 4 of us definitely all sought help and found it incredibly beneficial. Pretty much we all found that Jungian psychiatry was more effective than Freudian in our, for the sort of archetypal adventure that we were having. I found it strikingly helpful. There was one day when I got up and I was just like, I don't care anymore. And it's sort of hard because, the airlock door is right there. There's nothing keeping you from leaving Biosphere 2. I had a Soyuz cosmonaut say, he was 6 months up there, and the only thing that kept him up there for 6 months was that he couldn't get down. And he didn't understand how I didn't just run out after 3 months. So anyway, this day I woke up, and I didn't want to leave, but I didn't want to get out of bed, really. And so I called up the help that I'd set up, and about an hour later, I was doing pretty good. Talk therapy was shockingly helpful. And outside support from friends and family was amazingly helpful. And I actually went and we debriefed at all the NASA centers after we came out. And this was during the NASA Mir missions. And I'm eating into your time, but I'll just finish this one story. One of the astronauts who came back got on CNN and said, well, I could do it for 4 months on Mir, but 6 months would have been too much, the psychological pressure. So this big row happened, and so they had me back to Johnson. And the astronaut crew introduces me and says, this is nothing, we're not accusing you of anything, just thought you might want to hear Taber's experience and see if any of it makes sense to you. And this guy stands up, I won't name him, just on a courtesy basis, and says, I never said there were psychological problems on Mir, I'm leaving, and he runs out of the room. But anyway, what I said was that setting up support on the ground and having a very strong relationship with that support will make everything easier. And when Shannon Lucid flew, that's exactly what she did. And she was, I think, the most successful astronaut America has and will never have. And she was extraordinary. And one of the things that made her extraordinary was she had the strongest relationship with her ground crew of anybody that I've known. I don't know much about the current crew, but the example is when she was told that because of a problem with the shuttle, she was not going to come back after 4 months, she was going to be up for 6, and the return was delayed. the very first thing she said was, my flight surgeon in Moscow's wife is pregnant. I need him switched out because he needs to go back to his wife. She's going to have a baby. That was the first thing she said, was protecting her crew on the ground. So her relationship with that person and her family was so strong that I really think that was a big part of what kept her going. So it was very helpful. Ground support is an incredibly critical part of setting up a successful mission psychologically. And I don't think we did a very good job of that, and I guess that would be one of the other lessons learned. So thank you very much.